Our text that we're looking at today is in Mark 10, verses 32 to 45. And in fact, verse 45 in itself is a sort of one verse text for the whole thing. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. We're going to do some notes on individual verses, then we're going to look at some of the themes. First of all, verse 32. The two things which give context to this passage are that Jesus is concentrating on training his disciples, and that they're heading for Jerusalem, despite the way that Jesus has assured them that it will involve him in his own suffering and death. So we shouldn't be surprised at the reactions to this continued progress towards Jerusalem. The disciples, who've had more preparation than any of the others, are astonished. If the Master knows what he does about what's going to happen when he gets there, is he crazy to keep getting nearer and nearer to our capital city? Although we don't get much mention of the crowds at this stage of the story, there clearly were some who were tagging along, and they also knew enough to be afraid for what Jesus was walking into. Incidentally, when the Gospels refer to his followers, that's usually meaning the same as believers or even disciples. But it looks here as if the followers that it mentions here, it looks as if that refers to those who were tagging along behind the group who were making for Jerusalem and making other people who recognized anything about them, making these other people curious to know just what was going on. Verses 33 and 34. In this third prophecy of his passion, Jesus gives more details of how it will happen. For the first time, he mentions the role to be played by the chief priests. That it will be they who will condemn him to death, but then they will have to hand him over to a Gentile authority for the death penalty to be enacted. And then it says, 3 days later, he will rise. This statement has caused problems from the start. If you measure in days elapsed, then Sunday morning is 2 days after Friday. If you count the hours, then very early on Sunday morning is something like 36 hours after sunset on Friday, and we would usually call that a day and a half. Lots of early copyists noticed this oddity and modified the text. Most often it got changed to on the third day. Well, on the third day is okay. Counting Friday itself as the first day, the second day is Saturday, the third day is Sunday. So on the third day, that works okay. The fact of the matter is that for most people, counting methods in those days were not well disciplined. They would have been totally confused by that rather standard GCSE maths question that has 6 fence posts and only 5 fence panels. They'd have had brainache on that. So without our feeling too smug at our superiority, we must clearly take it that after 3 days was intended to refer to the Sunday, and that most people in those days would not have noticed anything odd about expressing it in that way. Verse 35, teacher, it says in most translations into English these days. Those of you who are well schooled in the older translations probably remember it as master. Now, those translations were made in the days when teachers were men in all boys' schools and they were known as masters. However much you like the ring of referring to Jesus as the master, you have to get used to the genderless word usually used today, and that's like as not is the word teacher. Verses 36 to 38, Jesus uses picture language to refer to what he's about to take on. Referring to one's fate as having a particular cup to drink was well established in the Old Testament. Referring to it as being baptized has no equivalent in the Old Testament. Jesus is introducing that one. Then verses 39 and 40. Either the two brothers here were impressively courageous, or they really had no idea of the price Jesus was about to pay. Possibly a bit of both. The fact that Jesus nicknames these two brothers as Boanerges, the sons of thunder, might point to a certain impulsiveness on their part. It really is a shame that although the Gospels tell us of this nickname, nowhere does it explain why it was apposite. Verse 41, the other disciples were put out, either because they were offended at the crudity of the two brothers' bid for fame, or because they were annoyed that those two had got their bid in first. You really don't know. 42 to 44, there are two words here for a servant. The first one, diakonos, obviously gets into English as the word deacon. It's the one that's used in Acts 6 for those who were appointed to see to everyday issues in the Jerusalem church, thus freeing the apostles to give their time to preaching and prayer. That's diakonos. The second word, doulos, can mean a slave, which is a long way beneath a diakonos, or it can refer to someone who's working under a bond, which gives them no freedom to do anything else or to be anywhere else, which is not quite as far south of diakonos as the other meaning is. Jesus uses the more general word, diakonos, for other people, but the harder word, doulos, when he's speaking of himself. I think we can take a hint on that. Verse 45, this and its copy in Matthew's Gospel is the only place in the New Testament where the word lutron is used for ransom. But it's the basic word for a whole family of words in Greek, others of which are used with a similar meaning, not least by Paul. In this verse, you also need a little bit of help with the word many. In the Greek, it's polloi. The expression hoi polloi has got itself into English as referring to the vulgar rabble, the ordinary people who have no claim on any sort of distinction. That's what you should hear in this verse. There isn't a the in front of many in the word, but I think you should hear it as saying to give his life as a ransom for the many, for the ordinary people around the world. It's an example of Jesus's extreme discrimination in favor of the poor and underprivileged. Let's step back and look at the story. First of all, the evidence of what Jesus went through. When Jesus speaks here of giving his life, it's no mere figure of speech. Let's remind ourselves of what actually he went through as he devoted himself to this cause. There was first his long tussle with the Jewish religious leaders, and you would have expected these people to have been at one with Jesus, but he evidently constituted a challenge to them, which they found quite simply too uncomfortable. Jesus began against the immediate background of the ministry of John the Baptist, whose outbursts seemed quite vicious. I mean, Luke 3 from verse 7, John said to the crowds coming out to be baptized by him, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Produce fruit in keeping with repentance. Do not begin to say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our father.'" Bit heavy, isn't it? And that's the background that Jesus was introduced into. As early as Mark chapter 2, we find the official local representatives of the Jewish religion accusing Jesus of blasphemy. That was their reaction to Jesus ministering to the man let down through the roof. They remained uneasy when Jesus called Levi, a tax collector, to be one of his disciples, and then proceeded to go to a party in Levi's house. The Pharisees get their first mention as his critics in Mark 2, verse 24, quite early still in the story. At that point, they're objecting to the work that Jesus and his disciples were doing one Sabbath as they walked through the cornfields, picking the occasional ear of corn and threshing it in their hands. They were welcome to have the corn, welcome to eat it. But picking it and threshing it, that was work. You can't seriously imagine Jesus having much patience with that kind of pettifogging attitude to the law of the Old Testament. The next Sabbath incident, Jesus healing a man with a withered hand, has the Pharisees creating an unlikely alliance with Herod's supporters explicitly to find a way in which to kill Jesus. That's verse 6 in chapter 3. The Gospel accounts are a bit confusing as to how many times Jesus went up to Jerusalem during his ministry, but John chapter 7 has an account of one time when it seemed unwise for him to go up to Jerusalem because of the known state of plotting against him. And at the beginning of John 7, it says this: "After this, Jesus went around in Galilee, purposely staying away from Judea because the Jews there were waiting to take his life." What we see later of Jesus would make us very surprised if he was acting here in anything resembling fear and trepidation. Prudence, I think, would be the right interpretation. But to have governed the Lord's movements in this way, the opposition must have been already pretty strong. In fact, as you'll recall, he resolved the situation on this occasion by going to the festival incognito. When Jesus did eventually enter Jerusalem publicly, very publicly, on a donkey, fulfilling the Zechariah prophecy, it drove him into a short and hectic period of open conflict with the various interest groups in the capital. His cleansing the temple was about as aggressive an act as you could possibly imagine from him, and it must have put the authorities' backs up instantly. He argued by turns with the chief priests, the elders, the Pharisees, the Herodians, and the Sadducees, each time Jesus sparring so craftily that he won each of those encounters, but of course only confirmed those groups as his sworn enemies. When we're mentioning what Jesus went through in order to stick to his cause, we usually jump straight to the story of his passion and death. I've just surveyed the lead up to that, which must have been pretty uncomfortable in its own right before he got anywhere near being arrested and so on. That's what Jesus went through. Let's rephrase that a bit. What was it that Jesus knowingly went through? There are 3 occasions when Mark recalls Jesus predicting what was going to happen to him in Jerusalem. The first comes just after Peter has confessed his faith in Jesus as Messiah. And it's interesting to see Jesus moving here. That's in chapter 8 from verse 31. Interesting to see Jesus moving here in an accurate word of prophecy, while Peter is still wrestling with his purely human feelings. You mustn't talk like that. Talk like that, in Peter's opinion, then, would have clashed harshly with the grandeur of speaking of Jesus as Messiah. Peter cannot at this stage hold those two ideas together. Jesus does, but Peter hasn't got there yet. The second prediction comes straight after the Transfiguration. The three disciples had had there an experience of the glory of God in Jesus, but they must not be allowed to go down from that mountain thinking it was all going to be an easy ride. And then the third prediction in today's passage. This one has more detail in it as to how this sad event is going to take place. One is that it will include betrayal. Another, that the Jewish leaders will hand Jesus over to the Gentiles for them to do the chief priest's dirty work for them. And then also Jesus will be abused through mockery and torture before actually being executed. And the same topic of conversation goes on into the incident with James and John. Jesus refers to what he has to accept as happening to him as his drinking the cup that he has to drink, his being baptized with a particular baptism. Although it must have been not entirely clear to the disciples exactly what was conveyed in that imagery, Jesus does declare that James and John will eventually share that experience with him. And they must, at least at this stage, have realized that it meant that there would be a downside to their following Jesus. Let's move on to the contrast with James and John. We've been looking at what Jesus went through, what he knowingly went through, what he had in his sights and yet steadfastly kept going. There's a big contrast spelt out in our story today when you compare Jesus with James and John, especially if you ask what was their driving ambition, what was their purpose in life. When Jesus appointed the 12, he gave James and John a nickname, Boanerges, which means sons of thunder or sons of rage. We get a glimpse of this when Jesus and his disciples are making their final approach to Jerusalem. We've got it in Luke 9 at verse 51 onwards. I'll read it to you. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. And when the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them, and they went on to another village. James and John were clearly in no doubt that in siding with Jesus, they were getting themselves into the leading group of people in this new regime. They revelled in that leading position, wanting to enjoy the power it gave them and the status. And their request in today's passage for the leading places in the kingdom is so out of line in Jesus' terms that it's been embarrassing right from the early times. I mean, presumably it's because of the embarrassment of two leading disciples making this request that when Matthew took this story and included it in his gospel, he alters it so that it's their mother, James and John's mother, who makes this request on their behalf. My assumption is that Matthew was just too offended by the thought that two of the 12 could be that uncouth. And obviously, you could easily imagine a Jewish mama doing this much for her boys. By contrast, Jesus used his extraordinary powers only in the service of his allotted task, which was almost entirely in the service of other people. And the way he treated his status, well, that's well described in Philippians chapter 2, that he took it as something not to be grasped at, but that he emptied himself of his status in order to carry out his mission on earth. Clearly, before James and John could be taken as people whose lives pointed others to Jesus, they were going to have to undergo some pretty radical spiritual surgery. It happened, but it obviously had not happened at the stage that we're at in today's story. What then about the contrast with worldly leaders? Jesus himself spells this contrast out between the kind of leadership that he's advocating and the way that worldly leaders usually lead. That's in verses 42 to 44. Jesus says that all Christian leadership is based on service. Among his followers, it simply does not work to have people who lead just because they want to lead. He needs people who lead because they want to serve. It's extremely easy to scan the pages of history and find examples of leaders who were clearly in it for what the experience of leading would do for them. People's assumptions about politicians are so often that they're usually seeking power for its own sake, so that in voting in an election, people assume they're choosing the least unsatisfactory person. Come away from those people like politicians who get themselves elected, and you can find tyrant kings right throughout history. Even more droll is what we've seen in the 20th century, that revolutionary movements supposedly returning power to the people have simply put people like Joseph Stalin in power, who have had more of a personal power trip than most of history's kings put together. And in the process of that power trip, they have put down the people who were supposed to be being freed from tyranny. But we've probably got some painful examples of this in our own personal history as well. Much smaller scale thing, but I remember quite painfully a time at school when I was appointed to lead a particular team, and after a short while, the rest of the team ousted me because they thought, probably rightly, that I was making leadership choices on much too personal a basis. And you can probably find some similar episodes in the way that you exercise your own leadership role in your marriage or in your family. Times you wish in retrospect that you could change what happened, but those blunders are there as a part of the record of what you have actually done. The standards of leadership which Jesus sets out, both in what he says and in what he does, are totally different from what comes naturally to us. In view of that, we could say that we get no prizes for identifying some worldly trait in our own attempts at leadership. What we ought to be looking for, rather, are the signs, whether they be few or many, that sometimes our lives are changing, something in our lives is changing in the direction of following Jesus in his style. So let's think a little bit more about how this applies to the likes of us. If you were to enter a religious order and become a monk or a nun, the great chances are that the tasks you would be given to do to begin with would be menial and repetitive, and you would accept those tasks not just because you're the newest recruit and after all someone has to do them, but more especially because they would be an important part of your spiritual growth. Being faithful in little things is a lead-in to being charged with greater responsibilities. It says that in Matthew 25 at verse 21. Even those already charged with leadership tasks are still expected to keep their hand in doing the little things. The leaders of the order, meanwhile, would be watching these novices to see which ones accepted the menial tasks and which resented them or kicked against them. The only ones that they could take on to the next stage would be those who had accepted the menial tasks with good grace. Some would make it through this menial stage with help. In the school I went to, there was a near legendary headmaster several generations before me. His name was Dr. Rouse. A story which lives on in the folklore of the school concerns one boy in the boarding house whose room was in a mess and who failed to clear it up after suitable instructions from the said Dr. Rouse. And then one day, when the boy arrived at his room, he found Dr. Rouse on his hands and knees tidying the boy's room himself. After that, shame made the boy accept that menial task without further ado. In a church like ours, the organisation is not that tightly structured around the spiritual progress of new recruits. You don't get, for instance, a spiritual director like you do in a religious order who tells you what to do at each stage. There could be a case for restructuring our churches with this in mind, but I think it's clear that it's not the way that things are usually done at the moment. So when you come into a church, you start attending regularly. Your expectation is probably that you'll just be a member of the congregation, left pretty much to your own devices, until, that is, such time as you're given some sort of ministry to perform. You're probably not expecting some menial task to be set up for you as the most positive and constructive way for you to get into the fellowship. I've often been impressed by how well the Salvation Army rate on this score. Because of the military way in which they're structured, there are many well-defined roles for people to play in a local corps, and you don't have to be attending Sunday meetings for very long before someone will come up to you and suggest one of those roles that you might play. Our own structure in the church that I belong to is looser than that. We think of a lot of the day-to-day running of the church as being accomplished by various teams, and there are occasional appeals for people to consider joining one or another of those teams. And alongside that are the connect groups in which you can get more involved with each other than we can by being together in a large congregation on a Sunday. The early church had got to a very interesting stage in Acts 6, when the apostles were able to be freed from some of the more routine tasks and enabled to devote their time to the ministry of the word and to prayer. In themselves, their attitude still had to be the attitude of servants, but they did their serving through those tasks most proper to their leadership role, leaving other things to other people. It's a sign of good health in a church when most people involved are helping with getting things done rather than just in turning up on a Sunday. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for the many. Bless you.